you just kind of laugh about it. You're like, yeah, I know what you're up to. Swooping in 30 minutes before closing time, right? So I don't know. I think it's something like that.
Nope, I'm a heathen. Yeah, I'm a heathen that upsets me. Even that story right there, I'm like, "Nope, screw that guy. Don't get him out of here."
All right, maybe it's worth revisiting about why we're doing these parables the way we're doing them. And we did this, I think, in the first episode, but this is episode 4 now. So maybe it's just worth kind of reiterating our approach to this, right? So
Yeah,
real quickly, we're talking about parables because they're a way to combat maybe our modern rational way of thinking. Because we tend to read a parable or a fairy tale, right? And we tend to want to extract the moral of the story, and then we discard the story, right? But one of the things that we're trying to do with these parables is saying that no, when we discard the story, we're actually discarding so much of the meaning, right?
right.
Okay, so not to get us on a rabbit trail, but you said you're reading the Odyssey because I was like, dude,
Yeah,
you've got to read the Odyssey. So it'd be like
I
saying,
know.
okay, here's the moral of the story. Now you don't need to know the Odyssey anymore. And it's like, no, man, you're missing so much information if you toss the story away, right?
Yeah. Well, you have the broad story of the Odyssey, but then and we were talking about this before we hit record, is that there's so many details, just like in a good fairy tale or just like in the biblical narrative. There's so many details in there that you're like, "No, go back and look at this. Why did they use this word? Why is this described this particular way?" And you find out that it actually plays into the broader narrative, but you just missed it when you're focused on, let's say, the story the first time you read it. It's almost like seeing a great movie 2 or 3 times. The first time I
Right.
saw A Few Good Men, it was a good movie, man. It was great, and, You Can't Handle the Truth, and I was excited about it, and I was like, "Man, that's a good movie." I've since seen it, probably a dozen times, and every time I pick on something subtle, and I'm like, "Oh, yeah." There's a different vantage point when you know the end of the story and you know kind of broadly what's going on, that you can pick up the details that you can't pick up the first go around.
Yeah, yeah. You can not pay attention to some of the stuff, not maybe so much focus on the storyline because you know the storyline now, but now you can focus on the side characters, right? Or some of the details. Yeah, I think
Right.
that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and if you
So
have a layered story, now I can dig into the layers.
yeah, now I can focus on this layer this time I watch it, right? Or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, I'm doing that right now with one of my favorite series on Netflix. I know I've said this before, is The Last Kingdom. I heard that it's going away this year, so I said I've got to watch it again. And it's probably like the 6th or 7th time I've watched the whole series. But yeah, a well-written series, every time you watch it, something new comes out, right? You go, okay, I
Yeah.
see this thread that I haven't paid attention to before. Yeah, so that's what we're trying to do with some of these parables because they're very common, especially if you grew up in church, especially the one we're going to look at today, the prodigal son, right? You
Right.
go, yeah, I
Right.
know that story. And it's like, okay, well, let's try to approach this a different way and let's try and pull on those threads that aren't usually pulled on.
Yeah, right. And this has a bunch of them too. This is a great one. Because again, it's in the broader context or a criticism about Jesus. And so Jesus comes up with a few of these parables that we'll discuss here in a minute. But, again, you got to have that context. You got to have that backstory laid out for you because that does color how you interpret this parable. And you don't do it in isolation as, oh, this is about a son who lost his way and then comes back. It's like, man, it's a whole lot more going on than that.
Right.
And so we'll get into it, but that's why we approach these in this type of way.
Yeah, yeah, that's what we're trying to do with these. A couple of things I'm learning real quick too is, man, the context. Before you just jump into the parable, go back to this verse in whatever chapter it is where it says, here's what Jesus was doing or here's who he was talking to. Because that frames the parable, right? That frames the next couple parables or whatever Jesus is going to talk about. And the other thing I'm learning is that when you start to group all these parables together, when Jesus uses common imagery, he's used it before probably in another parable. So you start to pull on that thread and go, okay, what did he mean in that parable, right? I think we talked about that
Right.
last time. And so those are just some of the things that I think I'm enjoying and I'm learning as we're going through these parables.
Yeah. So today, do you want to talk about the initial verses before we get into, like I said, we're going to talk about the prodigal son. Do you want to get into the initial verses of the backstory here of why he tells these stories?
Yeah, maybe we could do that, and then we'll let people listen to the actual story of the prodigal son. But yeah, you want to start with the backstory here? Because he
Yeah.
tells two little stories leading up to it, too, that are really interesting. Yeah, okay, so what's the backstory to this one? It's pretty simple, but they usually are. But what's the backstory going on here?
Yeah, yeah. It's just a couple verses at the beginning of chapter 15 that says the tax collectors and the sinners were all gathered around to hear Jesus, right? This is a image of Jesus hanging around with the less than, right? The prostitutes and the tax collectors. And then it says the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners
Yeah,
and eats with them." And then it starts off, then
yeah,
Jesus told them this parable, right? So, yeah, that's the backstory. It's basically that the religious leaders, the religious elite, were looking at Jesus saying, I don't really like the crowd that's starting to follow around him. I don't like the people that he's pulling toward him. And so, yeah, so it's this interesting thing that's going on where the religious leaders who should be out looking for the down and out, the people that society has pushed away, those are the people that the religious leaders should be looking for. And they're starting to hang around Jesus, and Jesus is getting this following. And the religious leaders don't like that. What do you think's going on with the religious leaders not liking the fact that Jesus is hanging around with the very people that they should be reaching out
well, I
to?
think a lot of these parables we're going to talk about today actually address that very issue. The picture I have is it says that tax collectors and sinners were talking with Jesus. Well, that's the wrong crowd, right? And it's if tax collectors are basically
Yeah,
turncoats, right? They're working for Rome. They're Jews who are working with Rome. And of course,
right.
sinners is a broad term of it's not like, well, we're all sinners. It's more like these are the unsavory people, right? Jesus shouldn't be hanging around. And so the picture I have is
Right.
the Pharisees are in the background. They want to hear what Jesus is saying, but they're not going to be part of this crowd. They're above it, right?
Right.
I
Yeah,
guess
they
you'd
don't
go
like
back to this idea. We talked about this previously, especially the Pharisees. The Pharisees thought that the kingdom of God would be ushered in when Israel adhered to the covenant and the commands of God. And so if you were a quote sinner, you were part of the
right.
problem. Now, you could say that, well, yeah, that's part of the
Right.
problem, but you should be leading the back end. But that's not really their perspective. They just were thinking, you're part of the problem here. You're why God's kingdom hasn't come yet, right?
Yeah. No, I'm glad you pointed that out because
Well, they
no, go
just
ahead.
couldn't get
Say
over
that.
that mental
Finish your thought.
hurdle. And I think
And so they
that's what Jesus is actually addressing in a lot of these parables.
yeah, and I'm glad you pointed that out because it is important to understand how the leaders in the ancient time, in Jesus's time, viewed sinners. Because it's easy to say, well, what kind of pastor, what kind of modern pastor would say, look, we don't want to mess with the homeless. That's beneath us, or we want only the rich people to come to our church. It's like that's a
Yeah.
terrible way to view. I can't even imagine a pastor doing that. But in Jesus's time, exactly what you just laid out is that they thought that these sinners were the problem, were the reason Israel wasn't being redeemed to the prominence that they thought it should be. That's the way the religious leaders were interacting with Jesus at the time. And the other thing to think about is the way the rest of the people interacted with what Jesus was saying. And so, again, we're going to get into it in just a second, but Jesus uses a couple of parables to sort of paint a picture about how the Hebrew God views us pitiful
Yeah.
humans, right? And remember the culture of the time. We just talked about what the religious elites thought. The culture of their time is that gods interfered with the plans of humans, but they certainly didn't want a relationship with us, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, they were disconnected at best, and they were petty and vengeful at worst, right? And so we mentioned the Odyssey earlier, and one thing that's obvious when you're reading Homer's depiction of humans relating to the gods, you have Calypso falls in love with Odysseus and keeps him from getting home by trapping him on the island, and then Neptune or Poseidon sees him sailing toward the coast and he interferes again, right? There's example after example of the gods interfering with human endeavors. And that's pretty much how the listeners in Jesus's time, the non-religious listeners in Jesus's time, would have thought about a limited relationship they could possibly expect from the divine. That's how they saw it. So it's kind of these contrasting ways of how people are
Yeah.
interacting with
And we're going to get
Jesus.
into that. Yeah, we're
or at
going to
least
get into that
Jesus' stories.
today too, because I do think in some of the later ones we talk about today, some of the ways you explain, wow, that's a weird story, is Jesus is actually kind of pressing, okay, how is it that you see God? How is it that you view interacting with the divine? Right. And so some of them are intentionally almost
Right.
absurd, extremely absurd, because I think Jesus is almost pushing that button of saying, yeah, this might be how you view God, and that might be part of the problem. So there's all that wrapped up in these stories. But yeah, not to get too much ahead of ourselves. So you had the Pharisees, their worldview, right? And that tainted the way that they
Mhm.
hear the stories of Jesus. So instead of like really wanting to understand what Jesus had to say, a lot of times they're like, nope, that doesn't fit our paradigm, right? That doesn't fit the way we view God. And so this is
Right.
going to be a problem. And so Jesus tells these stories, right? And so
Yeah.
should we jump into the first one? The first one is the parable of the lost sheep, okay? So really quickly, in response to the Pharisees muttering, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them, Jesus told them this parable. Suppose one of you had 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 and go into the country and find the lost sheep? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. And then he calls his friends and neighbors and says, rejoice with me. I found my lost sheep. So, very simple story.
Yeah.
And then the coin, we'll go ahead and talk about both of these. Then he tells another one, the lost coin, or suppose a woman has 10 coins and she loses one. Doesn't she sweep the whole house, search everything carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, rejoice with me. I found my lost coin. In the same way, I tell you, there's rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God when one sinner repents. Okay, so those are two very simple stories. But why do you think, well, let's start out by saying, why do you think Jesus told these in response to this interaction with the Pharisees?
Yeah. Well, obviously, the first thing is, yeah, if something's lost, you want to find it. So that's the simple explanation of why he uses these stories. But the first thing I thought when I read the story of the sheep specifically is, what is it that he goes out and he finds
Yeah.
it and then he calls all his friends together and celebrates and says, I've lost this. I was thinking, does that really happen? You think, is that the way a shepherd would deal with this, Because I would think that the real shepherds in the crowd are thinking, dude, I lose them all the time and you got to go track them down and
Yeah.
they wander off. And, no, I don't come back and have a big celebration. But maybe that's part of the sweetness of this story is that in this story, the shepherd comes back and he says, hey, I had a sheep and he's gone and now I've got him.
Yeah.
Let's throw this big party. So that was kind of a funny thing that I had thought about. The other thing that I thought about, I think it's kind of interesting that you don't want to miss that he has, because we love numbers, is that the pattern kind of escalates, right? You've got one lost sheep out of 100, you've
Hmm.
got one lost coin out of 10, and then of course we'll go into the prodigal son where you just have one lost out of the two sons. So you kind of see this escalating, this kind of the emotional stakes sort of increase. I guess, the more intimate it becomes. So he kind of tells these escalating stories. And I also think it's interesting that the sheep and the coin
Yeah.
are really, really short, but then he gets into this long, drawn out, more complete story
It's
of the
almost like he's
lost son.
priming the crowd for the big story, right? He's throwing out a couple little ones and they're like batting that around.
Yeah,
Okay, what is he talking about? Where's he going with this? And it's almost just like I'm reeling you in for the big story to come, right? Something like that. I got to tell this story real quick. Yesterday, my wife and I were cleaning out our closet. We're trying to make more room, incorporating some stuff. But my wife's in one corner and she's pulling stuff out and she pulls out a pair of shorts. She goes, are these yours? And I'm like, I don't think so. And she's like, they were stuffed way down in there. And I pulled them up and I'm like, these are mine. I used to love these shorts. I'm like, I thought they were gone. Yeah. I'm like, I'm wearing them right
these are my
now,
favorite
you know?
shorts.
And so it was like rejoicing over something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Did you call your
I will
friends
add
together?
one, the parable of the lost pants too, because like, yeah. And I didn't call my friends together, but no, there's something about the
Yeah,
excitement of going,
that's what I
oh,
was about
look
to
at
say.
that. There's my shorts. I love those shorts. So maybe that
Oh
idea,
yeah,
yeah,
yep.
so
I did
maybe
that with a
that
pair of
idea of like
sunglasses
he
recently.
calls his friends together, it's more of like the internal frame of mind. You're like, man, let's party. let's go out, man. I found my shorts or I found my sunglasses, you know?
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a good way of thinking about it, that it's not necessarily that the shepherd would call his friends and slaughter one of the
Yeah,
sheep and they eat
yeah,
them and stuff like that,
right.
right? You know, because that doesn't make any sense. But it is sort of a that's what's going on in the person's mind. It's like, "Yes, I found this." And it's funny because yeah, I did the same thing with a pair of sunglasses that I loved. I texted my kids, "Did I leave my sunglasses at your house? Are they at your house?" And everybody's like, "No." And I forget where I found them now, but I tracked them down. I was like, "There." Oh, they
Oh,
were
yeah,
it
okay.
was in a jacket pocket. I was like, "That's where they were, a jacket that I never wear," and I'm like, "I told you," yes, I'm all excited. Well, the thing that I was also gonna say is that I like that in both of the parables, the thing that's lost isn't asking to be found. You know what I'm saying?
Okay,
Does that
yeah.
make any sense? Like, in other words, the lost sheep and the lost coin don't seem to require a recognition of their lostness, right? They're simply misplaced, and for that reason alone, they're worth being sought
Right.
after. And again,
Yeah.
to think about it in the way that relates or the gods relate to humans. Remember, this is a pagan crowd and a religious crowd. But the way the gods relate to human, it's not necessarily how they would have traditionally seen the
Yeah.
way the gods interact with us. So Jesus is laying this story out, and it's also not really the way moderns interpret this story. In church, this story would be interpreted as a metaphor about salvation. It's almost more about like intercession or advocacy, maybe. The lost item doesn't have more value. Its inherent value is never realized, I guess, so
Yeah,
long as
okay.
it's missing.
Okay,
It's
yeah.
something like that.
So I think one of the things that I picked up on is, okay, so a lot of this is Old Testament imagery, and we're going to talk about more of this through some other parables. But when you think of a flock of sheep, that's the way Israel was sometimes described in the Old Testament. So as soon as you hear Jesus starting to talk
Sure.
about a herd of sheep or a flock of sheep, I think the people, and maybe especially the Pharisees, would pick up that maybe he's talking about Israel, right? And so that's the first thing I'd point out. I like the
Okay.
idea that you said whatever is lost, I forget how you said it, but you said it didn't intend to be lost, right? And so
Yeah, they they
yeah, they
they
don't
they don't
recognize their
recognize their
loss.
lostness, right.
Yeah, so
Now
that's a
the
little
prodigal
different.
son does.
But I think Jesus
Right.
initially is addressing the crowd, right? Where the Pharisees are looking down on the tax collectors and sinners and being like, why is Jesus hanging out with them? And Jesus tells the story then about a lost sheep. And I like what you said because if you're paying attention, one of the things Jesus is saying is, look, you're saying these are the lost sheep, right? And you're saying you're the problem.
Mhm.
And I'm saying that sheep didn't intend to go get lost, but it's the job of the shepherd to go get them, right? And so, in a subtle way, he's pointing
Yes.
out what their role
Yeah.
should have been. Here's what you should be doing, but instead,
Right.
you're to, think about the absurdity of getting mad at the sheep for getting lost. You dumb animal. What's your problem?
Right.
It's like, no, it's a sheep.
Yeah.
It just wandered off, right?
Cool.
And it's your job to go get it.
Yeah, it does what it does. Yeah. Yes. No, that's a great connection because you're right. I think that was a subtle jab at the religious leaders saying exactly what we said at the beginning. It's like, hey, these are the people that you're supposed to be going after. But instead, you're blaming the sheep or you're blaming the
Yeah, yeah.
coin. And how ridiculous is that?
That's right. That stupid $20 bill. If I ever find it, I'm wadding it up and throwing it away.
Yeah, I'm ripping it up, man. I'll show that. Yeah, I mean, it's like you're only
Yeah.
hurting yourself. Yeah, you're right.
All right.
That's a
So,
great
any other
connection.
comments about these little parables that sets up the story of the prodigal son?
I don't know. Again, I'm going to keep going back to this probably because I'm reading the Odyssey. I am going to keep going back to this idea that the way the non-religious listeners of this parable view the gods, right? And again, the gods traditionally, to start off, it's in response to the religious leaders clearly being upset that Jesus is getting like some unsavory following. But then the other side of it is the pagan listeners are thinking the gods don't traditionally mess with beggars and degenerates
Yeah.
either, right? If they interact with humans at all, they attach themselves to the brave and the beautiful and the powerful. Even the religious leaders seem to buy into this way of thinking. So, in this really interesting way, I've never thought about this. Jesus is addressing the two incorrect ways that people are
Yeah.
viewing God. And so, Jesus comes along with this story and implies that everyone, right, no matter what their social standing, is a valuable lost treasure worth searching for. And that's just not the typical mindset of the religious leaders or the gods, little g gods that the
Yeah,
pagans
and
viewed
that's why
as.
maybe he explicitly says there's rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. It's like, let me tell you exactly how God views this. Let me tell you exactly how this is playing out in the heavens, right? Just so you don't have your own preconception of what God or the gods are doing right now. Jesus says, I'm going to tell you explicitly how they view this. Yeah, I like that.
Right. Okay, so then we get into the deeper story or the longer story
Yeah,
of the
and we'll
prodigal
pause and
son.
let the listener listen to this story because it's probably familiar. But again, pay attention to the little clues, and then we'll come back and talk about it.
Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and thus squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.'"
All right, so obviously this is a very familiar parable. It's probably one that even if you didn't grow up in church, you could convey the gist of what this story is about, right? So this is one especially we have to pay attention to the
Mhm.
details and we have to think about it in maybe a little different way in our backdrop. So what's one of the first things that jump out at you? The little details of this story.
Well, okay, it obviously starts out with the younger son saying, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So right off the bat, this is something that
Right.
doesn't normally happen right until the father dies, and so he comes before the father dies and he says, "Give me my half of the estate." So right off the bat, it's obviously disrespectful, but it's also kind of absurd, right? I would think the listeners would be thinking, "Oh yeah, if my son did that, do
Yeah.
you know how far I'd
Yeah.
smack him?" You know what I mean? It's like they would all be kind of almost laughing at the absurdity of the younger son's request. So also in that time, it was kind of not traditional for the younger brother to get anything sometimes. And, go back to the parable last episode where the brother wants Jesus to demand that his older brother split the inheritance, right? And I actually meant to say this last episode. because it seems unfair that the older got everything, or at least the lion's share. But remember that we're not talking about cashing out a 401k or splitting up 10 bags of gold coins or something like that. This was an agrarian society typically, and so oftentimes all the wealth is tied up in farms or in livestock or in vineyards. And so it wasn't like it was liquid assets that we might think of today. And so the primary concern is to keep the family farm or the family business going. And in that case, there really needed to be one person that was one heir that was in charge of the daily operations. And typically that would be the oldest son. And so that was worth mentioning because in the last episode, we were thinking, yeah, that is unfair. Why didn't the older son split the assets with the younger son? But again, it's probably a business. It's probably a farm. It's not something that can easily be split. You're not just going to say, hey, we're going to sell everything. And so you can have half and he can have half. And that's just not the way it works. But anyway, to get back to the story, obviously the younger son sometimes didn't get anything and certainly didn't get the lion's share. And he did it before the father dies. And so this whole thing is just absurd right on its face.
Yeah, it's one
right
of
out
these
the gate.
where the story's so familiar to us that we have to listen to it again for the first time and let it shock us. Let it go, what a disrespectful little, little
Yeah.
punk that guy
What
is.
kind of punk? Yeah.
But you're
God,
right.
can
I
you
think the
imagine?
last time I read this, I picked up on that idea that it's not even the younger son place to even demand an inheritance. It's not like, well, you're splitting everything 50-50. Man, it's
Right.
not even your place. It's the older son who's supposed to do that. And I'm glad you pointed that out because you're exactly right. A lot of times, splitting an inheritance would mean basically liquidating the family business, right? Well, if we're going to pay you out, well, we're going to have to sell half
Right.
of that acreage over there. And we can work it out as the older
Right.
brother who would divide the inheritance. We can work things out. We can all live on this property, share the profits and all. But if you're asking to be cashed out, well, now I'm going to have to sell cattle. I'm going to have to sell sheep. I'm going to have to, liquidate them. And so that very much is implied with what's happening here, where it says he paid him out. You're right. He didn't just cash in a 401k. They probably had to liquidate land or maybe get out a loan. And so it's not
Sure.
only disrespectful to the father, it's
Right.
disrespectful to the older brother, too.
Yeah. And it kind of throws a monkey wrench in the whole endeavor. One of the cool things about you and I when we went to Egypt is, do you remember kind of we landed and on the taxi ride into Cairo, all these buildings had these rebar sticking out the top of it. You remember this? And so I said to the cab driver, I was like, man, there's a lot of construction going on here. And he laughed. He goes, where? And I'm like, look at all these unfinished buildings. And he's like, oh, no. Yeah. There's no roof on probably half of them, maybe even 60% of them didn't have a roof. And they were all concrete and floor by floor, but they all had this rebar sticking out the top. He said, oh, no. He goes, that's for another story in case another family member comes and joins. And he explained how it worked, where I think he said the eldest, the grandparents or the great-grandparents had the top floor, which is counterintuitive. Because, I'd rather be out on the street, right? But anyway, you literally moved up the level of the building that you were living on as more people in the family moved into the quote-unquote house. Now, these look more like, I'd say small apartments, some 4 or 5 stories. But in any case, it was a good demonstration of the way that they viewed the family assets. It wasn't seen as, again, a 401k where we're just going to split it 4 ways. It was this building that everybody lives in. And if we add somebody to the family, we're going to add another story to it. And then so for the younger brother to come along and say, take level 3 out of this building, I'm taking it with me. I'm cashing out.
Yeah.
You're like, well, that's not the way this works. Do you realize how much you're screwing up? And that's what he was instigating. That's what he was asking for. And so, it's just a crazy request.
Yeah, exactly. All right. But the father gives him the inheritance, right? Which again is a subtle, it says something about God, right? The generosity of God. Just that little detail. Because as absurd as the demand was, it's also almost equally absurd that the father says, okay, here's your half.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like I would hear that story and think, what kind of pushover, spineless father is this? That he doesn't say, put the son in his place, right? But again, he's trying to paint a picture here. And so he's basically saying this is not the way Yahweh God interacts with the lost sheep. This is not the way he interacts with them. He doesn't blame the sheep. He actually gives in to them, even when they're being
The other thing I'd
ridiculous.
point out, and then we'll move on to the story, is this idea of inheritance. And again, that has a lot of Old Testament background to it. The idea of Israel's inheritance was the nation of Israel, but then they were to be priests because the ultimate inheritance is all of creation, right? And so there's that thread in there too. There's that idea
Right,
of,
right.
here's the younger son. I even thought of this idea of Isaac and Ishmael, right? It's almost like Ishmael is the younger one who wants his inheritance.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, A, you're illegitimate. And B, it's like God has given us the inheritance of Israel, right? And you're running off into the other countries and stuff like that. So I don't exactly know how that ties in, but that thread is definitely there too as a backdrop.
No, that's good. Yeah, that Israel is the older brother,
And
receives
should
the
s-
inheritance.
and
Again,
should
we're
s-
not talking about bags
yeah,
of money, but the responsibility of perpetuating,
exactly. Yeah.
the family endeavor, right? And so they didn't properly carry out the wishes of their father. And so, yeah, no, that's a
So
really interesting thread to pull on. That Israel had their inheritance already, or at least they had their marching orders,
yeah,
and
so
they didn't carry it
it's
out.
very similar to this idea of the lost coin, right? Or the lost sheep. You're berating the sheep when you should be out going to find them. And so there's almost a sense right off the bat that the older brother, maybe you could say, isn't doing what he's supposed to do. And we'll come back to that because I do think that's in there.
Okay. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
worth talking about, but we'll get to the end. But yeah, okay. So the next section.
Yeah. Okay.
Uh,
So the kid goes out, and we can summarize this. Obviously, blows the inheritance. He goes to a faraway land, which, again, there's some symbolism there, right? He goes to another land. He blows his inheritance. He parties.
right,
I forget exactly what it says, but, wine, women, song, and the inheritance is gone, right?
right. Well, okay. So symbolically, I'm glad you said that about the faraway land. The inheritance is your future, right? It's your
Yeah.
identity and it's your future because it ties to, yeah, it ties to where the inheritance came from, right? So the inheritance represents identity and future. The distant country represents that we're separating from that identity. We're separating from the source, right? We're going to a faraway country. And then I think the fact that it's the youngest son and he's the early demand, let's say, before his father even dies, is sort of like this. It's like this desire for autonomy without the maturity to know how to handle it. And so that's what this story kind of lays out. It's more than youthful rebellion, is what I'm saying. It's easy to look at this and say, oh, we all know a wayward kid. And it's like, yeah, that's a component of it. But there's so much, again, this is so absurd that it's more than a youthful rebellion. It's like relational severance. It's like, I don't want anything to do with this family anymore, but I still want to demand what the family owes me, right? So to speak. And so, yeah, it's something different. It's something more than just
Well, I think the far off
wayward
land
son.
also, remember, Jesus immediately is in the company of tax collectors and sinners, right? And this is a problem for the Pharisees. And it's almost like the far off country is, yes, these are the people who are not Israelites, who are not Jews. And the question is, how are you going to view them? Are you going to view them as the problem, or are you going to view them as your responsibility? And so the far off country, right, is, and you go back to
Right.
Old Testament again, like the 70 nations, right? So there was Israel and the 70 nations. Well, he's off
Yeah.
partying in these 70 nations.
Mhm.
And it's almost posing the question, like, how do you view
Yeah.
this? Are you going to view it as God is going to restore these to his creation and his kingdom, and you are called to be a steward in that? Or are you just going to look down on them and say, well, at least we're Israel.
Right.
We're not one of those guys. And so all that is in there
Right.
already in this
Right.
story.
Yeah. Well, I like the idea of the inheritance representing their identity because that's what it is. And then when he wastes it, now that's dissipation of your identity, right? You've lost it. And the famine, obviously, is sort of this natural external crisis that exposes the internal emptiness of somebody without an identity now, right?
Yeah.
It's something like that.
Yeah.
And so, man, I'm glad you brought up the Israel connection because all this really takes on a more colorful meaning when you understand
Yeah.
that's another layer of this story is Israel's responsibility that was ignored, squandered.
Yeah. And I like
Wasted.
the
Yeah.
idea that the famine is the inevitable hardship that's going to happen, that's going to send your party crashing down, right? When you haven't planned for the future. Again, I like it. It's like the
Right.
far off land, the inheritance. You blow the inheritance, You're like, oh, I can get by. Well, that's fine until the inevitable crisis happens. And now what are you going to do? Right. And that's what the famine is.
Right. Well, yeah,
Yeah.
and
So,
you end up with the pigs. I mean, you're now I mean, you don't have to go we don't even have to go into the understanding of what a pig represented in Jewish culture, but yeah, you're at the lowest social position you can possibly be in, and it's because you didn't plan for the future, and it's because you demanded your autonomy without having the maturity and the responsibility to understand
yeah,
what that
that's
meant.
right. And okay, so the idea of him feeding the
Yeah.
pigs too, pigs were unclean. So in Jewish tradition, to be cavorting with the pigs and feeding with the pigs, like that is purely what the pagans do, right? So the youngest son is not only disrespectful, he doesn't know his place, but he is basically what you might say, he is fully indulging in every pagan appetite out there. Everything about him screams he is not part of Israel. He should not be part of the inheritance, right?
Right, right. So not only did he lose his inheritance, it's almost like he lost
Yeah,
his religion
yeah,
as well. You're now fraternizing with the pigs. You're running around in their slop. So obviously, it's a deeper meaning than he had a crap job. Man, he ended up having to roof houses or he ended up having to dig ditches. It's like, no, it's more than that. It's he's fraternizing with the unclean. And that's a way of saying that he's basically turned his back on his family, obviously, but he's also turned his back on his people. He's lost it all. He doesn't care about
yeah.
the fact that they're unclean or
And
anything
so
anymore.
that
Right.
actually stands in contrast to this idea of the lost sheep. It's like, well, the sheep didn't do anything to be lost, right? But now Jesus is actually upping that. It's like now the lost sheep has done everything in his power to separate himself from the flock. So what's the shepherd going to do here, right? That's kind of the tension building.
Yeah. Okay, man, I'm glad. Man, this is really interesting because now I'm thinking at first you think that let's say the religious elites would represent the older brother in this story. But now I'm starting to wonder if maybe the prodigal son is a pretty good representation of the religious elites. Do you follow? I mean, it could be a little bit of both, not meaning that they ran around and whored with foreign women or anything like that, but as much as they took their inheritance, they took the family endeavor and said, we're going to use this for our own benefit. We're not worried about what the purpose of the family farm was carrying out. I just want the benefits of the money that is coming to me. And so they took it. Right. And then, of course, they don't plan. And now
Yeah.
they're slopping with the pigs. I don't know. I'll have to think about that a little bit deeper. But I think that the listener could go maybe even both, a little bit of touch of both, relate both ways to both the older son and the younger son. And that goes for
Yeah,
the
there's
religious
definitely an
elites too.
inversion here near the end that we'll get to where the older son has been set up initially to be the good guy, the younger the bad guy. But the inversion happens at the end where it's almost like, okay, who's the bad son here? Which one really is the bad son? Right? And so, yeah, I think the
Right.
Pharisees would
Right.
definitely see themselves as the older son, but maybe there is a bit of an inversion going on here where it's like, look, are you any better than the younger son that went out and whored and is slopping with the pigs? And like, are you really any better than that? Because you've squandered your inheritance as well. Maybe it's something
Yeah.
like that.
Well, okay. So we're at this pivotal phrase that says he came to himself, talking about the
Yeah.
younger son. He's in the pig pen. He
Yeah.
looks up and he came to himself, right? It's like he realizes where he's at. And so, again, to go back to the sheep and the coin, they didn't realize they were lost. It's just a dumb sheep. It's just a coin that obviously doesn't, it just is misplaced. And so, this is the difference between this is now the younger son recognizes his lostness as opposed to the sheep and the coin. But also, in contrast to the older son, who, again, we'll get to it at the end, the older son really doesn't quite recognize his lostness, or at least we don't have a satisfactory answer on what happened with the older son. And again, we'll get to that in a second. But at least at this point in the story, the younger son came to himself. He looked up at the heavens and thought, what am I doing here? I mean, my father,
I
the
like that,
servants
yeah.
at my father's house, they get along better than I'm doing. So I'm headed back home, right? He comes to himself. And so he doesn't merely regret his consequences. It's like the light bulb goes off. And that's what that phrase represents. That
Yeah.
is just a pivotal part
And I
of the
like that
story.
realization that he's thinking about the servants in his own household. And he's like, man, they have it so much better than I do. I could just go back and be a servant, right? And it's telling too, because
It's almost
yeah,
like
yeah,
he's rehearsing his speech, you know what I mean? Because he's speaking out loud, and it's obviously for the listener's benefit, but it's just yeah, I can just picture him just saying, "Man, this is good," saying it out loud. "I'm no longer worthy to be called your son, but at least you can make me one of your hired servants." It's almost like he's rehearsing this interaction of how he thinks the homecoming
yeah,
is
yeah.
gonna go with his
And
father, right?
certainly he would have maybe even expected that his dad is not going to welcome him home. He's just going to, like, look, I disowned the family. I wrecked the
Oh,
family
yeah.
business. I disrespected the older brother. I don't even presume to go home and be a son anymore, right? I'll just be happy being a servant.
No, it's pretty obvious that he assumes
Yeah.
yeah, he assumes his sonship is
Yeah.
lost.
All right. So the son comes home, and to his surprise, the father runs out and greets him. And he says, quick, bring the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his finger, sandal on his feet, kill the fatted calf. We're going to have a feast and celebrate. So it's interesting, too, because there's that celebration again, right? We're going to celebrate what was lost is now found.
Yeah. And something that the ancient listeners would have picked up on is that Middle East patriarchal culture, fathers don't run, right? Fathers, that's just not something they do. And so the father running to meet him is almost like an image of the
Mm.
father absorbing the shame. That's the way I read that. It's almost like when the father runs out, it's almost like a way to deflect this nasty, mud covered, crap covered son coming up the driveway, right? And it's like, if I run out to meet him, everybody will be looking at me and my ridiculous, shameful act of a
Yeah.
man in robes running down the road. You know what I mean? It's almost like a deflection. And I think it's kind of him absorbing the shame, which is obviously a mirror of
Mm. Yeah.
Christ's role in the future, taking on our shame on the cross. At least that's the
Yeah.
way. That's one way to look
It's
at that.
almost like the father is setting the tone for how everyone else is going to treat this lost son coming home. Because by rights, he should be standing on his front porch and saying, well, I'm going to make this kid grovel, right? I'm going to make him come crawling up to me before I give him his room back and stuff like that, right? But by running
Yeah,
out, it's
sure.
like
Right.
he's setting the tone. He's setting the tone for the servants, for the neighbors. It's like, oh, wow, the son is welcome back, right? Without a doubt.
Right. Yeah. And it's kind of cool because the son, while he's in the pig pen, is rehearsing this speech of here's what I'm going to tell my father. And he
No, he
never
doesn't
has a
even get
chance
that
to do that.
opportunity.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's almost, yeah. And so before the son has the opportunity to finish this rehearsed speech, the father, he calls for a robe. He calls for, oh, yeah. What do you think about that? He calls for a robe. He calls for a ring. He calls for sandals. And we have this feast. Do you see the symbolism in any of those things?
I haven't thought about that, but put on the best robe, put a ring on his finger. My guess is the ring probably represents like his status in the family again. It's not just like,
Yeah,
a
family
ring you
identity,
got at
sure.
Hot
Right,
Topic or
just not a
something like
random
that,
ring,
right?
yep.
This is your status in the family. So my guess is the robe and the ring and the sandals all represent, don't even ask questions. Like, this is my son. He is back, maybe in charge of whatever part of the business, even.
Right.
My guess is something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Right. Well, okay, so yeah, I noticed that right away. I was like, okay, man, you know how it is. Now that we think in these symbols, I'm thinking, all right, does that mean anything? And so I thought, okay, the robe is restored dignity or something like that. We're assuming that he's like covered in mud or at least he's dirty and unshaven. So we're going to put a
Okay,
robe
yeah.
on it, and that's restored dignity. And then you've got the ring that is, yeah, that's sort of that family identity.
It's the bond. It's the covenant,
like you
right?
said. Yeah, right, right. And so it's authority. He's restored authority. And the sandals are interesting because he is now a free son. He's not a barefoot servant, right? He intended to go back as a barefoot servant. But the sandals, it's not just that, oh, he doesn't have any shoes. It's a representation of servants went around barefoot. Sons don't do that. And it's like, put the sandals on him. Let's not have any more of this talk about you're coming back as a servant, because that's nonsense. You were a son. And then, of course, you got the fatted calf, which is a public celebration, a public announcement that my
Yeah.
son has come home.
It's the
right?
celebration. Yeah, all that I think is something like, because you might expect the father to say, go wash up and then we'll have a big feast. But it maybe the robe and the sandals, it's all just like, I don't know. I'm covering all the filth, right? You don't even have to go wash up. I'm covering it for you.
Yeah, right.
You're going to wear my robe, put your ring on.
Yeah.
Here's some new sandals. Don't even take time to wash up. Let's just party. It's something like that.
Yeah, and so again, it's like, yeah, it's like he's
Yeah.
absorbing the
Yeah.
shame, which again is that Christ figure, is what he's doing. Everything he's doing, he's either covering up the dirt or he's absorbing it himself by running.
Huh.
Yeah, I think it's just kind of a beautiful image, even getting past the simple dad running down the driveway to meet you. Man, there's a lot of weight to the
Yeah.
words and the symbols that Jesus has
All right.
used.
So we're having the celebration, and then we pivot to the older brother. Then the older son was in the field, and when he realized what's happening, he said he heard music, dancing, right? The DJs showed up and all that. So he calls the servants, says, "What's going on? Your brother's come home." Now, it's really interesting because it says the older brother became angry and would not go in. And at least in the NIV, it says, he says to the father, because the father comes out, he says, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you." Now, that's really interesting, and it's probably been serving you. But there's something very disrespectful of like, "I've been your slave for all these years." Like, that's a very disrespectful thing to say to your father. "I'd have never disobeyed you."
Yeah, I
Yeah,
highlighted
yeah.
that because that's a
And
key
so
line,
you
right?
never gave me a goat. Basically, he starts whining. And here's my other brother. He goes and screws off and comes home, and you celebrate him. And basically, this isn't fair, right?
Right. But it's interesting because obviously the younger brother has his problems and that's been outlined. But then you got the older brother and that line, "All these years I've been slaving for you." He sees himself not as a son, but as
Yeah,
an
yeah,
employee, you know? And so that's the way he views himself. And so I don't know, there's something about that makes me think, what is it? Proximity to greatness doesn't equal greatness. And it's something like proximity doesn't equal intimacy. And so here's this son who's right by his father's side in a literal sense, but he feels like an employee, or at least he sees himself
yeah,
as an employee. And so he's not intimate with the father. He's only close to him by space and the fact that he's on the
yeah.
same property and he never ran off, right? And so it's kind of this picture of like obedience without love becomes transactional or something like that is the way I see the older brother
Well, I
kind of
think it
making his case there.
really exposes the motivation of the older brother. He's coming across as, or he wants to present himself as the dutiful older brother, right? "Dad, I've worked for you.
Yeah.
I've done everything right. I've done everything you asked me to do, right? I've never disobeyed your orders." I don't know where the mom was, but I'm sure the mom's like, "Yeah, I can tell you." And yeah,
Oh,
a number
where's
of
mom in
times.
all this? Our mom
Yeah,
would
and
be
give
right in the
that look.
middle of it, I
"Really? You've
promise.
never disobeyed your father?" Right? Anyway, but I think he's really exposing what his true motivation is, right? And there again, it translates into that,
Right.
here's how I view God. Here's my relationship with God, right? If I do everything right, I'm going to get the inheritance. It's not only I'm just going to serve you, it's like I'm going to slave for you. I'm going to do everything right. You're going to have no cause to question my loyalty. So when you die, I get that inheritance, right? And it's like, okay, now we're getting,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
now we're
Again,
getting
it's
to your
transactional.
actual
Yep.
motivation here.
I also thought, because when it said that the son was out in the field, the older son was out in the field and he heard the party and he comes in, I kind of
Sure.
felt bad
Yeah.
for the guy. I'm thinking the younger son shown up, the least you can do is send a message to the older son out in the field and say, "Hey, your brother's back and, fly straight.
Yeah.
I know he's been gone, but we're going to make this a celebration and blah, blah, blah." Right. But it's like he didn't even get wind of it. And so there's a part of me that's like sympathetic to the older brother because it's like, yeah, well, thanks a lot for telling me. I would have liked to have
Yeah.
joined in this celebration. Now, his response kind of exposed that it wasn't the case, but it's almost like he didn't even get the chance. And so when I thought about that, when I thought about the fact that, yeah, I'd be upset if I were the older brother and I wasn't invited, then it says that the father leaves the party to go
Yeah.
talk to goes to the older son, right? And so I think it's this dual image. The father leaves the party for both sons,
Okay. Yeah.
right? The father runs out of the house and runs down the road to meet the younger. And then he has to leave. They're in the middle of his party, right or wrong, whether they invited the brother, but he leaves the party to go out to the older brother. And it's painting now this picture of God pursues both the rebellious and the resentful
Yeah.
or something like that. So anyway, that's how I made peace with the fact that they didn't that they didn't let the older brother know that he had to find out secondhand from a servant that
Well, and
his
maybe you could
brother's
read
back,
into that,
right?
but maybe the dad, I mean, come on, dad kind of sees through a lot of this stuff, and so maybe the father actually he sees the dutiful older son, and he knows it's kind of an act. And he knows he's going to be angry when the screw-up son comes back, right? And so maybe it's just like, I'm not
Right.
going to bother him. He's just going to throw a little temper tantrum because I know what's going on beneath. Maybe it's something like that. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, what did you think about when he told the son, "All I have is yours"?
Yeah, I mean, he's still saying, look, the inheritance is yours.
Yeah. It's almost like he's saying, "Calm down. I'm not
Yeah,
going to blow
yeah,
the whole family
yeah,
farm on this celebration, right? This is all yours, son." It's like he's done what he's done with his inheritance. Everything I
yeah,
have is yours, as he tells him. Yeah, he's almost like reiterating, "Don't worry. We're not running out of money yet, and
yeah,
everything I have is yours." I just think it's interesting that both sons, that the first half of the story mirrors the second half of the story, right? Both sons misunderstand sonship. The younger son says, "I'm unworthy to be your son." And then the older son says, "I
yeah,
deserve more as a servant," right? It's this misunderstanding by both sons, and both think of in terms of earning, you know, that the younger son says, "Look, just give me what's owed to me and I'll get out of here. I'll get out of your hair." And then the older son is upset about, obviously, he's afraid that the father doesn't realize that everything he has is his. He's going to waste it on this younger son. And it's just both in terms of kind of what I can get out of the deal or in terms of earning and very
right.
little
Yeah.
relationship in this
I also
story.
think you said earlier that we tend to think of this as, well, this is how an individual gets saved or something like that. But you've also, I think it really helps to see this corporately as Israel versus the rest of the nations. And there's a little bit of foreshadowing with the prodigal son coming home
Yeah,
of there's a little bit of this foreshadowing of you're not going to like this, but this message of the kingdom of God is going to reach throughout the Roman Empire and Gentiles are going to be a part of it, right? So you have
yeah,
this, I don't know, you
yeah,
have this like inversion. I use that word again because the older son's done everything right, but at the end, he's like resentful of everything. The younger son has strayed, but at the end, he's actually being folded back into the family. Well, again, that's the tension of Jews and the
right.
Gentiles, right?
Yeah. Well, to go back to the younger son, "I'm unworthy to be a son." That's sort of the unified voice of the Gentile. And then the older
Yeah,
son says, "I deserve more." And that could represent the unified voice of the Jews of the original covenant. It's like, we deserve more. Shouldn't we have a higher status place than these Gentiles? And I'm sure those were conversations that went on all the time as Jesus kind of came and created this new covenant and
it's
and
almost
outlined it
as
this
if
way.
Jesus is sitting with this crowd of tax collectors and sinners, and Jesus is subtly saying, look, this rabble is who's going to inherit the kingdom of God. And pay attention to the younger brother because you're not going to be happy about it. You're the older brother who's going, well, wait, what about us, Jesus? We followed all of the 613 laws of the Torah and we tithe meticulously and we're in synagogue every Saturday. And you're going to let this rabble in? And it's like Jesus is saying, yeah, you're exposing your true motivations here because it was never about how do we keep
Yep. Yep.
how do we keep creation together, right? How do we do our part to find what's lost? How do we bring the younger brother back in? It's like you're just in it for yourself.
Yep. Well, the younger son
Yes, yeah.
rebels openly, right, in front of everybody, makes a mockery of the whole family. And the older son rebels, but it's internal. And that's just a perfect picture. That's a perfect image that the older son, if it represents Israel, is like, there's a
Yeah.
rebellion going on there too. Don't miss that, right? It's just internal. And so one is lost in wild living and the other is lost in moral superiority or something like that, right? I mean,
Well,
it's just, I don't know. It's just
yeah, and it
that's a
reminds me
great
actually of
tension
another
between
quick
those two.
teaching that Jesus, I didn't put this together till now, that Jesus said, I'd have to look it up, but basically he says there's a story of two sons where he says one son, the father says, go do this, and one son says, sure, father, I'll go do it, but he doesn't. And the other one says, oh, forget you, I'm not doing that. But
Oh
then he
yeah,
feels guilty and he comes back and he does what the father asked. And Jesus says, which one
and he
was
does it.
obedient? And it's almost like that's a Cliff Notes version of this parable right here, right?
Yes, that's
Yeah,
excellent. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, no, that's great. And I think it's interesting that there's no resolution with the older brother to kind
yeah,
of wrap this up. It's almost like it's saying that the story's end is yet to be seen. or something like that. It's deliberate. I
Right.
think
It's
that's
almost
what's
like,
going
yeah, it's
on,
up to you how this ends, right?
Yeah, it's something. Yes. Yeah, that's right. And then also it's just kind of, again, this is Jesus saying
Yeah.
this is how God works, right? This is how God is represented. And if you take this whole story, you see that God allows freedom. He what absorbs shame publicly. We talked about that aspect of it, that he restores identity without having before the performance of the son actually earns his sonship back, right? He restores that identity before that. He celebrates the repentance more than the obedience because the son coming back is a repentant act. And that's what we're celebrating, not the
Yeah.
obedience of
Yeah.
the older son, so to speak, right? And so it's just kind of this whole package that Jesus is tying together in this brilliant story is that, I don't know, that God's joy over repentance, it almost like it disrupts our idea of fairness, right? And I think that's what this is supposed to do. I think you're supposed to leave thinking, well, what a terrible story. That wasn't fair. You're going to take this son back. You're going to diss the older son, not invite him to the party, and you know what I mean? And I think that's what's supposed to. It's supposed to be a shocking story of grace. And it's almost like Jesus is saying, if this bothers you, get used to it because you're about to see a more shocking display of grace here
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
a few years.
Yeah. Well, that actually plays into this idea of fairness. I think it actually plays into this next parable we're going to talk about. So this one's found in Matthew chapter 20, and it's kind of long too. So why don't we just pause and we'll let people listen to it, and then we'll come back and talk about the workers in the vineyard.
For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. About 9 in the morning he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out again about noon and about 3 in the afternoon and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?" "Because no one has hired us," they answered. He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first." The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon came, and each received a denarius. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These who were hired last worked only 1 hour," they said, "and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day." But he answered one of them, "I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous?" So the last will be first, and the first will be last.
All right, so there you go. Yeah, this one has always kind of bothered me because the previous parable, it just doesn't, this one even more so, it doesn't play into our modern idea of fairness because you listen to it and you're like, well, I'd be upset too. You know what I mean? So let's take this from the top. What are your takeaways right from the beginning? And then
Well,
I
so
never heard
first of
anything
all,
after
the
that. So go ahead.
setting is that Jesus is in Galilee. It says he's been teaching to crowds. The Pharisees are there and his disciples. So this is several chapters of the teaching. So at least, as Matthew arranges all this, this is all in the context of Jesus' teaching. It also starts off with the kingdom of heaven is like. But probably this is better. You could think of it in terms of your heavenly Father is like this, because it's more about God, right, than just the kingdom, broadly speaking. But that's the setting anyway. Yeah, so the
Right.
first thing, I guess, is you need to know that a denarius is a day's wage. So today, I don't know, maybe $150. And
Yeah.
another
Something like
quick
that.
thing I'll point out,
Yeah.
and then see what you think about some of the details. Is this is another one where it says it was harvest time and he needed workers for the vineyard. Okay, the vineyard is another symbol of Israel. All right, so again, and people sitting there listening to
Okay.
Jesus talk would pick that up. Okay, Jesus is talking about God's relationship with Israel. Okay, so this isn't just a common at the harvest time, people would need to go reap their fields. But again, the vineyard is code for Israel. So I need workers in Israel
Okay.
because it's harvest
Yeah.
time. And harvest time is another code for judgment, right? And we're going to talk more about that the last episode. So those are some of the nuances I see.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked about other parables. Yeah, we've talked about other parables where the wheat and the chaff, so yes, harvest is always tied to
So there's all
judgment.
that symbolism then going into it, which might help make more sense of it because, again, like you said on the surface, it is very unfair. I'd be upset too, right? And the short story is that he goes off at certain
Yeah.
times during the day because more people are needed to finish the harvest. And it's also interesting too because
Right.
it
Right.
says he went out, at least in the English version, it said he went out at 5 o'clock. And I believe that the day ends in Jewish times at 6. So basically, these last workers who were brought in at 5 p.m., they worked 1 hour, right?
Yeah, that's even worse, man.
Yeah, so they
You
worked
worked
1
one
hour.
lousy
Yeah.
hour,
So those are some of the details. I don't know. I have a story to tell,
Yeah.
but I want to hear if there are any other details that jump out at you first.
Yeah, not really particularly, other than the fact that the obvious details of, I'm glad you pointed out the vineyard and judgment, because it does give you a little bit better perspective than simply, working 8 hours or 10 hours in a day versus 1 hour and you get paid the same. You're like, well, on anybody's metric, that's unfair. But when you're looking at, look, the harvest is coming, time is of the essence. We need to get people out there. Everybody needs to be doing their job so we can bring the harvest in, and there's more of a time crunch idea. It's almost like the closer you get to judgment, the more valuable every single worker pitching in is. You can kind of look at it that way.
Yeah, and actually,
Okay.
my understanding is that's true when it comes to harvest time, when it comes to vineyards. You and I have been to a couple of vineyards. I've been to Napa before, and my understanding is time is of the essence. Like there is a short window, or you start losing fruit, right? Or that fruit isn't at that peak readiness. So it is all hands on deck. So there is that aspect to it. So it's a great image, actually.
No, that's a helpful image, because I've always taken this parable to kind of mean that just because someone has lived a horrible and selfish life and at the end they come to accept salvation, it doesn't give us the right to say that's not fair, right? I kept the commandments my whole life and this guy comes along at the last second like the thief on the cross, and receives the same salvation as me. But with you saying that, it lets me know that there's a little bit more going on than being that simplistic.
Yeah, part of this parable is that time is of the essence. This is the urgency of the kingdom of God coming, right? So this is also Jesus, again, talking about his own ministry. Like things are going to come to a head, they're going to move quickly, and time is of the essence. That's definitely built into this.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's helpful. What do you take about the whole, the last will be first and the first will be last, right? Because we've read that comment before in other places. And I always read that as a sort of a comment on status, right? The rich and powerful got their reward in this life, maybe, but the poor and meek didn't. And therefore they'll be elevated in the next kingdom or something like that, right? Why in this parable are the last to be hired the first paid? Because I think that's an interesting aspect of it that takes it a little bit deeper than what I
And
realized.
I think
on
there's
the
a couple
surface.
things going on. And I think it helps to tie it into some of these other parables as well, like the older brother versus younger brother. If you see the last in as being the Gentiles, right? So the last will be first and the first will be last. It's that older brother attitude again, right? Hey, we've been faithful the whole time.
Yeah.
Why the heck are you paying them a full day's wage? I've worked here all day. And it's almost like
Right. Right.
it's almost like those who see, well, there's the individual level too, where, those who see themselves as above everyone else as actually going to have a lower status in the kingdom of heaven. But there is also this corporate thing where it's like,
Okay.
if you have the attitude that, look, I've done everything right, I deserve whatever's coming to me. And Jesus is like, no, that's going to put you at the end of the line, right?
Right. Okay. Because I read it's like, okay, it's already a benefit to come late in the day because you got paid as the people working the whole day. But then on top of that, you're getting paid first. Now, at the end of the day, I guess everybody gets paid, but it's like an extra insult. Not only do we all get paid the same, but the people who came last, I'm paying them first. So you better hope I don't run out of money on them. Something like that. I'm like, what? That's crazy. That's absurd. But you're right. When you layer on the Israel connection, then it helps frame this a little bit clearer than simply a status thing. You know, the person who thinks they're something special is going to go to the end of the line versus the meek and the poor.
Yeah, I think it also speaks, gosh, it speaks to humility, right? That if you are going around thinking, man, I'm this super Christian, God must be super proud of me. It's like, man, you're going to have to go through a period of humbling, right? Not necessarily back the line, but like you're going to have to,
Right.
because you have to enter the kingdom of God with humility. You can't see yourself as more deserving than everyone else. But yeah, that corporate dimension really helps. I said I
Right.
had a story. I'll tell the story real quick. When my wife and I
Okay.
moved from up north back down to Florida, where we're from, for about 6 months, I worked at a florist. And it was actually a really fun job. If it paid better, I would have just done that, right? But it was just a job to get by until I could find something that paid better, right? More of a career. But one of the fun things that we did
Right.
is it was pretty big florist, locally owned. But at Christmas time, we would decorate neighborhoods. We would decorate like entrances to subdivisions. One of the fun things was we
Okay.
decorated at Universal Studios in Orlando. I think it's like the Islands of Adventure, like
Oh,
all
that's
the
cool.
restaurants and clubs area. We would go in early in the morning before anyone was there, and we'd be decorating some of the restaurants and clubs and all that. And yeah, so you get to see a behind the scenes look of all that stuff. But we'd also decorate individual homes as well. So it was Christmas time and assigning work groups, and a couple of people had said, man, you want to go decorate this lady's house. I'm like, okay. So very nice house, obviously a very wealthy woman, a very gracious woman too. But at the end of the day, at the end of the project, we're done decorating. She said, all right, looks great. And then like people started lining up and we're going, okay, what's going on here? And she starts handing $50 bills out as tips slash Christmas present. And everyone who worked there got a $50 bill.
Okay.
And so this happened a couple times. And
Yeah.
the next year, we actually said, hey, if you need help on that house, we'll be happy to go. So even though I had another job by then, yeah.
Yeah,
And I can
sign me
remember
up.
like a couple of the people would show up about an hour before we're done and go, hey, just wanted to show up, see if you guys needed any help cleaning up. And we're like, no, we know exactly what you're doing. You're wanting to be in line. And,
Yeah.
sure enough, she's handing out
Yep.
$50 tips and they're in line too. But I think of that and I think like, so I could look at that as profoundly unfair, or I could just look at it as everyone joining in this woman's generosity because none of us expected a $50 bill for a tip, right? So I don't know. I look
Initially,
back and I'm
right.
like, I
Right.
wasn't even that
Yeah.
mad about it. You just kind of laugh about it. You're like, yeah, I know what you're up to, swooping in 30 minutes before closing time, right? So I don't know. I think it's something like that.
Nope. I'm a heathen. Yeah. I'm a heathen that upsets me. Even that story right there, I'm like, nope, screw that guy. Get him out of here. I want to expose him. When he goes up to get his $50 bill, I'm going to say, hey, you
Yeah,
know that he
yeah.
just showed up like 10 minutes ago. You know how he's playing this game, right? No, that is absolutely great. No, that's a perfect story that lines in exactly with what's going on here. To your point, it's about the generosity of the woman's house. It's about the generosity of the vineyard owner. And it's only unfair if we have the mindset of
Yeah,
comparison to others or something like that. Yeah, it's perfectly fair if we agreed to work for denarius. But there's an implication here that when we consider what other people have done and what other people have been forgiven of, right? Because this is ultimately about forgiveness. Then we fall in this trap of thinking that someone else's debt is
yeah.
greater than yours. Do you know what I mean? And so that it's kind of what I'm saying is it's kind of absurd to imagine the mindset of a person that says, "Man, I could have gotten away with so much more my whole life and just come in at the end." Right? And it's like that's not forgiveness either. That's like that's
Yeah,
missing the
right.
whole
Yeah.
point also. You know what I mean? When you see it as forgiveness, it's just, yeah, it frames it a little bit clearer, right? And there's this one line that kind of often gets missed in this. It says, "Or are you
Yeah,
envious
that's a great
because I'm
line.
generous?" Right? I
Don't I
forget the
have the
exact
right to
wording.
do with
That's
what
a
I
great
want with my
line.
own money,
But
or are you envious because I'm generous?
right. No, because that frames the problem. That gets to the root of the problem. The real issue isn't fairness,
Mhm.
right? It's envy rooted in
Yeah.
comparison. That's the real problem. And you could think about it like this. The first workers are not angry about their wage. They're angry about somebody else's blessing. That's what they're angry about. And that's what this
Yeah, yeah,
parable kind of lays
exactly.
out.
Yeah, anything else about this?
I don't know. I just think it's spiritually diagnostic. It's very similar to the older brother in Luke 15. You've got this pattern. You've got the older brother resents grace, and then the early workers, they resent generosity. And so you kind of see this pattern between these two, and I think they connect well.
Yeah, and that's where I think it does help to let these parables interpret each other. Because once you get a picture of the older brother, now you also get a picture of the workers who were there at the beginning of the day, you know? And I do think it's important that it's like, hey, I paid you a full day's
Right.
wage. What are you complaining about?
Yeah, everybody
Yeah,
got paid.
so it's not like you got cheated. All right, so a couple
You're
more.
right.
And
Right.
these are shorter, so we'll try and move through these pretty quick. All right, back in Luke chapter 11, there's a shorter one. It's called the friend at midnight. So in Luke 11, Jesus says, suppose you have a friend and you go to him at midnight and say, friend, lend me 3 loaves of bread. It's late at night. His friend has showed up for a journey and he's out of food. And the one inside says, don't bother me. The door's already locked, right? The children are in bed. The wife's asleep. Don't bother me. It's interesting because he says, even though I tell you, he will not get up and give you the bread because of friendship, yet because of your shameless audacity, is what the NIV says, or because he doesn't want to lose face, right? Or something like along those lines, he will give up and give you as much bread as you need. Now, I forgot to say this was a parable about prayer, all right? So in that context, this is
Right.
really weird that the one inside is really kind of a jerk, right?
Right. And
Yeah.
he's the
So
God
so what do you
figure
think's
in
going
this
on
in this
with this
metaphor.
presenting really God as this person who is kind of annoyed that you're banging on his door, but well, he'll give it to you because it's the only way to get rid of you, right?
Right. Well, I think this is less about this is, like I said, that this is God in this metaphor. I think it's less about that and more about this is the way people perceived God or the gods,
Right.
in that time, in that culture. They're like, yeah, I'm not going to go to a God and ask for bread for the day. That's just not something that I would take to the divine. And so I think this is trying to present an image of even if this kind of jerk homeowner, if he's going to end up giving bread to the neighbor because of the persistence, how much more is a loving God that actually loves you, actually wants to have a relationship with you, like the image in the prodigal son? How much more is he going to do that? And so I think it was more of addressing the way the listeners viewed God in the day as opposed to
Yeah, I
this is
think
what
that's
God is
right.
like.
Because it's interesting that right before this, we should have kind of laid the context out, but the disciples say, teach us to pray. And he actually teaches them the Lord's Prayer, right? So it's interesting that part of the Lord's Prayer is give us this day our daily bread. And then he tells this story about asking for bread, right? But it's just so strange that he,
Yeah.
presents
Yeah.
it as like, man, you got to pound on that door and beg this guy for bread. But I think you're right. I think he's actually getting at this is how you view God, and I'm telling you this is not how God is, right? If you pray the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread,
Right.
you will see that God provides. You don't got to be the guy pounding on your neighbor's door, annoying him until he throws a loaf of bread out the window at you, right? But that's how too many of you
Yeah.
perceive
Right.
God. Yeah, I think you're right. That's what he's saying.
Yeah. And the other confusing thing is the word, what did you
Yeah,
say in the NIV? Shameless
yeah.
audacity. So I read that and I'm thinking, well, that's how I'm supposed to pray with this shameless audacity. But I think, and I looked this up, the word, I forget what the Greek word is or the Hebrew word, but it implies a boldness rooted in relationship. It would be the audacity of the president's 4-year-old son walking into the Oval Office and saying, Dad, will you play with me? It's more of that image. You could look at that and say, that's ridiculous. What 4-year-old can walk into a president's office? Well, the son
Yeah.
of the president can, you know what I mean? And so that's what it's laying out there. But also, so when you see that kind of the boldness in relationship, you also get a picture of there's something desperate about persistence. right?
Hmm.
I'm most persistent about the things in which I'm most desperate, right? And I think we view that word persistence kind of like the kid throwing a tantrum in a grocery store, right? Or the kids in the back seat, are we there yet? No. Are we there yet? No. That's like just a persistent, annoying, that kind of annoying feature. But persistence can also imply that I've tried everything else, nothing I can do is working, but you have the solution that I can't live without. It doesn't shout because it wants attention. It knocks because it has nowhere else to go. That's the type of persistence
Yeah.
instead of the
Yeah.
the annoying kid in the back seat.
Yeah. And that's going to tie into the next one we're going to talk about. But there is that idea of persist after something that you really want, right? And I think that speaks to, I don't know, I read that because that's definitely in both of them. I think it speaks to this idea of, I don't know, sometimes in prayer we say things flippantly, like, God, it would be great if you gave me this. And it's like, well, how badly do you want it? Right.
Yeah,
And it's not like this
right.
dangling, it's not like this,
Yeah, how
okay,
desperate are you?
I'm dangling this in front of you. It's more like, okay, if you want it, let's work together. Let's make it happen. But you're going to have to work, right? You're not just going to sit back and I'm going to throw this thing in your lap, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it goes back to this idea that we talked about a couple episodes ago about truth in the Garden of Eden seemed to be self-evident. You didn't have
Yeah.
to work for it. And after the fall,
Yeah.
now we're going to have to work for it. Now we're going to have to dig. Now we're going to have to work the soil, those types of things. And I think it's something like that. It's like when you pray, you have to be persistence means desperation. And what are you desperate for? What are you really searching for? And if you're really desperate for something, come to God in prayer. And like you said, it's almost like, yeah, we'll work this out together. And not that I'm just going to drop it in your lap. It's not just going to fall from the sky, but yeah, we'll kind of do this as a relational arrangement the same way you would if you went to your dad and said, "Hey, dad, will you help me with this or that?" Kind of a disconnected dad would just say, "Yeah, here, how much
Yeah.
do you need?" and write a check for it. Most reasonable dads are going to say, "Yeah, let's work together. Let's figure this out. Let's do this." Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's kind of the image that they're painting
Okay.
there.
So I also wondered, I wonder if this idea of, the neighbor, gosh, this gets into it. The neighbor doesn't want to give any bread. I wonder if that's almost a picture of how the pagans approach their God, right? We're asking God to bless the harvest. So we're
Yeah.
going to do all these elaborate things and we're almost going to annoy the God or we're going to bribe the gods, right? In order to give us these things. And if we've done everything right and we've made the
Yep.
right sacrifices and we've done all this, then maybe the gods will pay attention to us momentarily and bless our harvest. So maybe that's a picture
Right.
of, hey, this is how pagans think prayer works.
Yeah, no, I think it is. It's more about the listeners
Yeah.
of the audience, how they viewed
Yeah.
God, as opposed to this is the way God is.
Okay,
Yeah,
this
I
is
think you're right.
really similar then. We're going to try and move on. This is really similar to another one in Luke 18, that is the unjust judge. And this is another one while I go there. This is another one where he says, he told them a parable to show them they should always pray and not give up. And then he said, in a certain town there was a judge. Now it's interesting, who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. He goes out of his way to say this judge is a godless jerk, right? But the woman had been
Yeah,
slighted
right.
against. The woman kept persisting, right? And finally the judge relents and says, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, even though I don't fear God or care what other people think, I will see that she gets justice so she won't come and attack me, or basically so she'll just stop bothering me. And then he says, it's interesting, he says, listen
Right.
to what the unjust judge says. And so again, it's almost like the judge is obviously the God figure, but again, it's this, maybe it is back to the
Right.
idea of, hey, and some of you, this is how you view God, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, and I think this is important. Jesus doesn't
Yeah.
say that God is this type of judge. He uses an imperfect image to reveal a truth, a perfect truth, maybe. And this judge, like you said earlier, this judge is some kind of shadow version of what people fear God or the gods might be, right? And so he says something like, even if the world were run by such a cold, such a disconnected God, then endurance and persistence will lead to justice, right? And that's probably the way the pagans viewed this, you
Yeah.
know? And again, it just takes me back to that discussion about truth, that in the Garden of Eden, that truth is evident. I don't know. There's something there. And I think he's saying that this parable of justice kind of in that same way. It's going to be a struggle. You're going to have to dig and you're going to have to find. And that's kind of what they're
Yeah,
laying out there.
just we were talking. I also think there's a tie into earlier parables where it's like the wheat and the tares, right? You have to coexist
Yeah.
with the tares, right? In an imperfect world, you have to coexist, but there is still goodness in the world. And I wonder if there's a thread of that of, look, you're going to deal with unjust judges, you're going to deal with unfair people. But if you persistently pursue what is true and good, there is goodness to be extracted out of the world. Something like that.
Yeah, justice can be found
Yeah.
even in an imperfect system. So therefore, if you're going to enter into a relationship with this perfect God that I'm trying to lay out for you guys,
Right.
then how much better can that be? And it's using the imperfect image as a contrast that this even, it maybe he says it without saying it. Like, this even works with the pagan gods, guys, right? You know, this works with Zeus and this works with, your pagan gods. And so don't you think it's going to be that much better with Yahweh God? I think that's kind of, there's a little
Yeah,
bit of
that's
a
true.
hint of that at least.
And look, I think we all fall into a trap at some point in our life of we have an incorrect view of God, right? And like I can tell you that there was a time where, I don't know, I'm very right and wrong oriented. And there was a time where if I did something wrong, I was sure God was mad at me, right? So God to me for that time period was the really harsh father. Oh, you screwed up again. I'm going to come after you. There's
Yeah.
going to be consequences. And I had to learn to shed that. And so I can see a story where Jesus might tell someone like me or someone, well, yeah, that, hey, a son went to his father who was always harsh, right? But in the end, didn't the father love his son or
Yeah.
something along those lines? And it's like, okay, that's not so much about God as it is
Yeah.
how maybe my relationship with God right now.
Well, that's what's so great about the prodigal son is I think everybody can relate to I'm either the prodigal or I'm the older son. It's just really easy to put one of those shoes on. And it's funny you say that you're the older son or you're very black and white because between you and me, I am the younger son and I'm the prodigal, that kind of runs off a little bit and gets a little wild. But yeah, it is. It's just you can relate to one or the other. And so that's why I think that parable in particular is so powerful. But it's also all these parables. I mean, it's okay. Look at the parables we went through today. We went through lost things are found, generous wages,
Mm.
bold, persistent prayer, the persistent widow, right? And what unifies them is not fairness, like we talked about. It's not merit. It's not ritual, right? What unifies them is that the kingdom operates on relationship, not transaction. It's something like that. That's the kind of unifying element with all those. And when you see that, all of these together, that's why all these parables together really paint a picture of a God that wants a relationship, not a God who
Yeah.
operates in either fairness, like maybe the pagan gods did, that the richest and most powerful are the ones that are going to get their blessings. It's the exact opposite of all that stuff. So really, Jesus is kind of upending both the religious leaders that are, go back to the original question of the religious leaders were worried about who Jesus is hanging out with. And so he's answering that issue with the lost items, but at the same time, he's answering the other issue of this is not how the pagans view their God either. And so he's upending both people's worldview.
Yeah, and when you take all these together, it is interesting. I imagine if you followed around Jesus and you were writing down what he was saying, and like you do get a really clear picture of, okay, whatever my view of God is probably totally wrong, right? Because you're saying God is wildly generous, God is forgiving. You're also saying that everyone who I think is on the outs with God is going to be the first in. And you're also saying all the self-righteous people, all the really good people, they're going to have problems. They're going to have issues. It's
Right.
I think you have to let it just scramble your worldview, right? Taking all this together, and you just
Yeah.
go, well,
Yeah.
gosh, talk about truth. You're like, well, I don't
Right.
know what's true anymore, right? Because you're just like scrambling my whole view of what
Yeah.
God was like and what religion is like and the place of the pagans around me. And all right, I'm going to have to reorient my whole worldview and look at things differently. Well, that's exactly what Jesus was trying to do here.
Yeah. And don't we do this today? If you were to run into somebody that said, "Oh, man, listen, God doesn't want to have anything to do with me. You have no idea the dumb stuff that I've done." You're like, man, the Bible is full of stories that talk about people who do dumb things and still and are still considered sons. It's like you're exactly who Jesus is looking for, right? But it just undermines all your worldviews, whether you're the religious elite who says, well, at least I'm keeping commands. It's like, well, don't be so quick to think that your feeling like a servant makes you a son, right? And then to the prodigal, it's like, well, I'm not worthy to be your son. Well, don't be so quick to cast your lot with the pigs. There's a father that's going to run to meet you. And so, and I just love how this undermines so many different worldviews, and it just paints an amazing image of God that people even today struggle with, but certainly the people of Jesus' time, when you understand how they viewed God and the gods in
that's
their
right.
culture.
Man. And there's even stuff we didn't get to, but I think we're out of time probably. So, yeah, gosh, everyone.
Yeah, we went a little long on this one.
Well, and
So-
we've been having technical difficulties throughout this whole episode too. So this has been a struggle to get through.
Yeah, that's probably worth saying that if you see the audio drop or something, we'll try
Yeah,
to edit
if you
that stuff
see-
out. But
I'll
that's,
edit out the part where I threw my headphones
know.
across the room because my mic accidentally muted for the 20th time. But yes,
Yeah.
some of the behind the scenes thing.
So if you know of a good internet service provider in the St. Pete area, please leave comments.
No, this is another one where
Sheesh.
I don't know. I don't know. I come back to this idea. You can't just read one parable and go, yeah, this is what this means. You have to take them all in and you have to let them interpret each other. All right.
Yeah.
So we're going to wrap up next time with the threshold moment parables. I know we've said several times that there is a big aspect of judgment in a lot of these parables. And that's what we're going to talk about next time.
Okay, great. All right, man. There we go. Thanks for listening. We hope this conversation gave you a fresh way of seeing these ancient stories and maybe even a new way of seeing your own life. If this episode was helpful, feel free to share it with someone you think would enjoy it. You can also find more episodes and resources at Navigating an Ancient Faith. Until next time, keep paying attention, and we'll see you in the next episode.